in terms of information in the Brazilian cannabis industry. So I mean, thank you guys a lot for making time and to be with us. So before I proceed and introduce our special guest, I would just like to make this one announcement. That is, this session is being recorded. We decided to do it fully in English, but in a couple of days, 3 days from now, we'll be making this material available with subtitles in Portuguese and Spanish, okay? So that we can reach out to, with no mistake, to the entire Latin America community, okay? And Steve, just give me 1 second. I'll say that in Portuguese, just to make sure that people got this information, okay? Real quickly. Então, assim, para nossa audiência no Brasil e na América Latina, nós estamos gravando essa sessão e no máximo em 2, 3 dias nós iremos disponibilizar o material completo com legendas em português e espanhol, okay? So, with no further ado, it's a great honor, truly a pleasure, to introduce, the father, so-called father of the cannabis, legal cannabis, the cannabis industry. There's so many nicknames, Steve, that I don't know. What I can say is that you're a lot of people here in our country like hearing from you. You're an activist, you're an educator, you're an entrepreneur, you're an investor, you're an author. So, we have a lot to learn from you. So welcome to Brazil. Welcome to the Cannabis Thinking Talks, and pass the ball to you, as we say it over here in Portuguese. In terms of soccer, I'm passing the ball to you for your initial remarks to the Brazilian tribe, as you described in your recent post. Okay, thanks for being here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Alex. And I had the pleasure last year in 2019 of spending 200 days on the road, and I almost made it to Brazil, but not quite. So I very much look forward to coming to Brazil as soon as it's possible for us to do that. I think that the situation of Brazil now is one that I'm just really beginning to learn about and figure out. But I know that there's a rich history of cannabis in Brazil. I know that there's millions and millions of people who have a special attachment to the cannabis plant throughout the country. I know that there are thousands and thousands of families who have been one of the leading forces in moving reform forward and keeping this conversation happening. So I'm really excited to hear about these very beginning steps towards reform in Brazil. And moving forward, my mission in life is really going to be doing what I'm doing now, which is speaking to the global cannabis community. There are now millions of us, tens of millions of us, hundreds of millions of people around the world who have been touched by the cannabis plant. We are in all different countries, we speak different languages, but we have a common appreciation of the plant and a common work to bring that reform forward. So that's what I'm planning on doing, is talking to all of the different emerging cannabis economies around the world. And Brazil, of course, is now joining what's becoming an ever-growing wave of cannabis reform all around the world. It really started in California during the AIDS crisis, when we were able to pass the first medical cannabis laws and start being able to publicly distribute cannabis. And our goal then was to demonstrate to the world that that could be done in a way that brought benefits to communities rather than harms. And I think we've been very successful in doing that. And of course, we saw that reform first spread across the United States, and then to Canada, and now to the rest of the world. I am looking forward to keeping that pace up, to increasing that pace, to bringing this movement together all around the world, including Brazil.
So this, count on us, okay, to echo all you just said. You know, we're big advocates, and this is a 200,000 million population, so it's a gigantic country, you know, and we're just getting started. So this is how it's going to work, Steve. We have about, give or take, an hour, you know, with you, give or take. I will circle the questions. We'll be covering different topics, and I'll just be the facilitator. So, you know, circling around the questions. After you're done, a couple of minutes for comments, and we'll take it from there, okay?
Sounds like fun.
Okay. So let me start with my buddy over here in the left-hand side, upper hand side. Marcelo has been in the industry in the Brazilian industry since day one. You know, these guys, with his cousin Marcel, founded the Green Hub. And, you know, so Marcelo, please, it's a pleasure. Kick it off.
Steve, really big pleasure to talk to you and to address these questions to you. So let me go with my first question. So it's clear that cannabis has become essential worldwide. The US and Canada's government tried to keep dispensaries closed that only lasted a few hours. The US and Canada's government tried to keep dispensaries closed only a few hours. Countries are right now in the verge of some type of recession. Brazilian agribusiness occupies a well-deserved place in the country's economic development. We have conquered new markets, invested in technology, and little by little, we are managing to keep young people in the field. If you could send the Brazilian government a message right now, what advice would you give them in terms of accelerating cannabis cultivation regulations?
Well, I'd say that now is the time to move, and it's the time to move quickly. The really good news about cannabis is that there's a lot of different types of cannabis, and depending on the historical and cultural and legal conditions in any country, there's almost some sector of the industry which can get started. So, you know, I understand in Brazil now that most of the cannabis, aside from the associations, is restricted to import. And I think that that's just a crazy thing for any government to do to their country, because my belief is that one day, maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in your lifetime, Marcelo, cannabis by dollar volume is going to be the most valuable product in the world. The basic reason for that is that anything that you make from a tree or from petroleum or from cotton can be made less expensively and more sustainably from cannabis. So there's a vast realm of opportunity to develop a cannabis industry without even dealing with the political issues of psychoactive cannabis. So I'd say that's a sector that the government of Brazil should be looking at very quickly. I'd also say that the important thing to do now is also recognize that there is an existing cannabis industry in Brazil, that there are many, many people who make cannabis their livelihood, who have been involved in the gray market, unregulated underground trade. And I think that it's important when any country starts thinking about regulating cannabis to think about bringing that underground market above ground and making sure that the people who participate in that market are able to reintegrate and re-engage with a legal market, which is better for the country and better for those people.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Steve.
So yeah, of course. Let us. Anybody want to kick in a comment, or just should I just move around to Paula? Daniel.
Just one question. We have heard a lot about the legal in California, for instance, the legal market and the legal market. Since they open for medical or adult use, but the illegal market still is going on. how do you see, what could you say about that?
So just to encapsulate this for the audience, in 2018, there was a very big change in California. We went from a nonprofit medical cannabis market to a for-profit adult use market. And when that change happened, we went from a patchwork of quite loose local regulations to a statewide system of regulation. And that system, unfortunately, did two things that were very bad things to do, especially at the same time. One, it made the licensing requirements so high, so difficult, so expensive for anybody to actually get a license that the majority of the existing cannabis growers in California were unable to enter the legal market. They simply did not have enough money to be able to go through the licensing process. At the same time, there was a tax policy which allowed every entity and jurisdiction in the state, local entities, county entities, the state entities, to tax cannabis. And there was a kind of crazy overtaxation of cannabis. So the average tax on cannabis went from about 10% in the medical market to around 50% today in the adult use market. So what happened is you had all of the consumers who were coming to the medical cannabis dispensaries. When we switched over to this new regulated system, they went into the shop and they saw these really crazy high prices, and they went like running out of the shop with sticker shock. And they ran right into the hands of all of the underground growers who were unable to get legal licenses. And so those two demographics of people are now servicing each other very effectively in the unregulated market. So today, when I'm speaking to investors or the media, and they ask me who my major competitor is, I tell them it's the illegal market. That's really the only competitor that I worry about.
Yeah.
Today you still face this problem.
Oh yes, we still face this problem today, and I think that there's another important regulatory lesson in here. There's a lot of governments who view the legalization of cannabis as a opportunity to radically increase their tax revenue.
Okay.
And to make a lot of licensing fees. And I would urge them to resist the temptation to do that. There's a few reasons for that. One, almost everywhere around the world, there's a well-established, unregulated cannabis distribution system. And because it's unregulated, because you don't have cost of compliance, you don't have inspections, you don't have specialized equipment, it is much less expensive to operate in the unregulated realm than it is in the regulated realm.
Right.
So already, when you're trying to legalize cannabis, there's a bit of a competitive edge that the underground market has. But when you put higher taxes and higher regulatory burdens on there, then you really just make it impossible. Better to keep the taxes either non-existent or very reasonable. I think that one approach that countries should consider is a 2-year tax holiday. Have a cannabis tax, but do not impose that tax until year 3 of the legal licensed industry, to give the legal licensed industry some equal footing to compete with the unregulated market, where, of course, no taxes are being collected.
A little bit more on this subject. I'm sorry. So could Colorado be a positive example on that matter? Did Colorado get that done well?
Colorado didn't have as big a challenge in doing that as California did. But yes, Colorado did a much better job of it than California. Their regulatory burden was less and their tax burden was less. But also, Colorado really did not have an extensive cannabis production economy prior to legalized cannabis. They generally imported most of their cannabis from Mexico or from California. So it was less of a challenge to erode the underground market because that market was much weaker in Colorado in the first place.
Excellent
So,
answer.
just to wrap up this question, and that we can move on. My comment would be availability. You mentioned a lot about taxes and prices and competition with the underground. but availability, do you think that is an issue as well in terms of distribution, you know, making it available quickly on the legal basis for more dispensaries, I don't know, for example, or, you know, through the web? Availability, distribution.
The very best way to tame the underground market is to use market forces. And that means to create a viable legal industry that's capable of competing with the underground market, both in scale and on price and on quality. And so scale is important. You are not going to be able to quell the underground market if you don't issue thousands. In a country like Brazil, there has to be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of licenses that need to be issued. And, you know, how those licenses are issued is very important. And, you know, there are some states in the United States that have required companies to be vertically integrated in order to get cannabis licenses. There are other states like Oregon, which have essentially prohibited any form of verticality in the supply chain. And so, and you're thinking about gearing up an industry quickly. I'm really a fan of promoting an industry where you may allow some degree of vertical integration, but the regulatory incentives are set up to license a very large number of people, each of whom can occupy a specific niche along the supply chain, rather than a few number of licensees who operate across the entire supply chain.
Super, super. Paula, let me turn it to you now, and please go ahead.
Hi, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I thank you also the great Green Hub guys for the invitation. And I'm here representing Humanitas 360 Institute, which is an institute founded by Patricia Vilela Marino and her family. And it proposes a broad view about the question of violence and mass incarceration. And we work now mainly with women in prison. And here in Brazil, more than 50% of women are in jail because of drug-related crimes. And they are on the street selling, transporting. They are the weakest point in the chain of the drug dealing. And they are definitely not the most important or the most dangerous people on this chain of drugs. And while this process of changing the mindset about cannabis are happening, we start to wonder what those people in jail thinks when they hear that there is legal businesses out there selling cannabis and they are arrested because of this. So you can imagine how happy we were to hear about the Last Prisoner project that you founded. And I'm curious about it, and I wish you could explain to us a little bit how it works and the results achieved so far.
Well, Paula, thank you very much for the question and for the good work that you're doing in prisons with 360 Humanitas. The Last Prisoner Project has one very simple-minded, single-minded mission. And that is to make sure that as we build this worldwide global legal cannabis industry, as people build wealth, sometimes very large amounts of wealth, intergenerational amounts of wealth, that the people who are still in prison for doing exactly the same thing are released, are brought home, and are given the resources that they need to rebuild their lives. So we do this work in a number of different ways. We look to our funding primarily to the legal cannabis industry, which has very generously supported our work. We've been in existence for a year. Prior to the COVID crisis, we were concentrating on two main areas. One was clemency. In states in which cannabis has been made legal in the United States, the governors have an ability to release cannabis prisoners. And so we've been working to get them to do that. And thus far, We haven't persuaded very many of them to do that, but it's a long process. And in the middle of this work, the COVID crisis hit, and it's really as I imagine it is in Brazil. COVID is ubiquitous in U.S. prisons. And so our 40,000 constituents who have been convicted of nonviolent cannabis crimes could face a death sentence by being there. So we've been working on a legal procedure called compassionate release, which we've been more successful at. So we've been able to help several prisoners be released on that basis, and we're continuing to push forward other cases. So, and then the other part is helping people rebuild their lives. And of course, cannabis prisoners are released every day. And so we have an ability immediately to assist them. And so we have a program that first introduces those released cannabis prisoners to mentors, people who are working within the cannabis industry, who can mentor them and teach them and be their personal advocates, introduce them to their network of associates. We have developed a training curriculum so that released cannabis prisoners can learn the basic skills that are needed to participate in the legal cannabis economy. And then we have a partnership with one of the leading cannabis human resources placement firms to place those graduates of the training course. So all of that's underway. Our first class is just waiting the lifting of the COVID restrictions.
I have a question on that. Yes, countries like Brazil that they're just starting to regulate cannabis. How could we start already thinking about a project like yours, like the Last Prisoner project, right in the beginning? So should we start? What was the secret to start a regulation already thinking about that?
Well, that's a great question, because I'm sorry, Alex?
No, I was just going to say on top of that question would be, how can we help here in Brazil to echo, for example, an institute such as Humanitas 360, how can we, bring more support to your project in our country, on top of Marcelo's question?
Mm-hmm. So I think that what we really want to look towards is as we implement reforms, we want to make sure that cannabis prisoners are included and are thought about. That has not happened in most countries to date. So if you look at all of the reform laws in the United States or in Canada, none of them specify that cannabis prisoners should be released after cannabis is made legal. You would think that that would just happen, but it doesn't. And so if you don't take specific steps to make sure you have language in your laws that call for that to happen, those prisoners, and I'm sure there's many, 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 many cannabis prisoners in Brazil, will just remain in prison. So that's the long-term goal. In the short term, what we found is that the most important thing to do is to give face to our constituents and to tell their stories. Most people who are not familiar already with what's going on are shocked when I tell them stories about people like Michael Thompson, who is 69 years old, who is imprisoned in the state of Michigan, serving a 40 to 60 year sentence for selling 3 pounds, that's 1.5 kilos of cannabis, to an undercover detective in the 1990s. So just to give you a metric, right now, the police officers who have been charged in the death of George Floyd are facing maximum sentences of 40 years. And Michael Thompson is serving up to 60 years for the sale of 3 pounds of cannabis.
I have some comments on that.
Sure.
Here in Brazil, we don't have much data and information about this cannabis-related crimes. We do have about drug crimes, but not on cannabis specifically. And in the United States, I see that you have a lot of information about this kind of crime. how did you started to produce this exactly information?
Well, it's been challenging because what we find in many places, Brazil, the United States, the individual states here, is that law enforcement authorities tend to like to lump cannabis crimes in with all other drug crimes. And there's a reason for that. At least in the United States, out of all of the arrests that were made during the war on drugs, over 80% of those arrests were for cannabis offenses, for non-violent cannabis offenses.
80.
And so they don't really want to publicize that because it's such an outrageous fact. But the families of people who have been imprisoned on cannabis charges know who those people are, and they know who their stories are. And so what I would say is that you call out to the families of cannabis prisoners and start soliciting the data that way. And then I find some really good young journalists who want to be investigative journalists and send them to all of the record depositories that you can find anywhere and see, you know, what you can dig up. Sometimes what we found is that in some US states, it's easier for us to determine what is a cannabis crime and what isn't. In some places, it's completely impossible.
So a young journalist, there's one here right beside you that might make a note of that. Daniel, let's pass the ball to you now, please.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank to Steve for sharing with us Brazilians a little of his vast experience in this sector. And I also want to thank you, Alex, Marcelo, Paula from Green Hub for organizing and bring this such important conference and event to the Brazilian market. Steve, could you tell us a little about your history since the beginning of founding Harborside, all the way that all the problems that you had to face up to now that you have a public company, and the sector of cannabis is much different than the beginning. Could you tell us a bit of the history of your job, and what you could, in your opinion, the Brazilians could learn about that, could take advantage and try to implement here?
So I came to, well, let's start with Harborside. Harborside was one of the first 6 cannabis businesses licensed in the United States of America. This happened when my hometown of Oakland, California became the first place in the United States to license medical cannabis dispensaries. And so there have been a lot of challenges along the way. The first challenge was just getting through the licensing process. No city anywhere had ever developed a licensing process, and they did some very silly things in the course of that process. One of the things that they did was they had very serious proximity restrictions that restricted any of the locations in the city in which you could put a cannabis dispensary. So after 6 months of searching, I was only able to find 2 locations that met the city's requirements and had property owners that were willing to lease to me for a cannabis dispensary. So that was the first challenge, was just meeting the regulatory requirements and figuring out how to get that license. Not long after we licensed and we were opened, we were subjected to the first of many attacks by the federal government of the United States. While cannabis and our activities were legal under the laws of the state of California, of course, the federal government in the United States to this day continues to refuse to recognize the medical uses of cannabis. So the first attack came from the Internal Revenue Service, the taxation authority. And they basically imposed special rules on us that led to an effective tax rate of about 75%, which of course made it very, very difficult for us to even keep ourselves afloat, much less be able to grow as a company. So we fought that case, and that case actually, I just finished filing a new motion in that case. It's still going on. It started in 2009, and it's going on now 11 years later. We're still fighting over this. Shortly after that, the government tried another tactic, since the taxing us didn't really work. We were still around, and that was to seize the property that we were located in, that we did business in. And there's a procedure under US law that allows the government to do that with no criminal convictions. And so again, we fought that litigation, and nobody really expected us to win, but we did. And one of the ways that we won was by developing very, very deep community ties. So in the middle of our fight with the government of the United States, the government of the city of Oakland filed a complimentary lawsuit supporting us, saying that if the federal government closed us down, a public health and public safety crisis would result in the city of Oakland. And that was one reason that we're ultimately able to win that case in 2016.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Go ahead.
No, please.
No. Could you tell us also a bit about when did you open the harbor site?
2006.
Okay. And last year you went public, was it?
Yes, we went public in June of 2019.
Okay. Okay, Alex, go ahead.
Okay, so it's my turn, and it goes along the lines, okay, that we're just talking about. And this is my favorite topic. It's really entrepreneurship and, innovation. And of course, we must say that, when we started the Green Hub back 3 to 4 years ago, Marcel was in the U.S. Marcelo's cousin was in the U.S. And ArcView, was something that we said, well, we looked at ArcView and said, well, this is what we want to do when we grow up as an organization. Okay, so I mean, impressive numbers, right? I mean, you guys have raised over $270 million investing in somewhat 200 companies, okay? I mean, just to put it in perspective, we're just getting started here in Brazil. The Green Hub has just announced in the beginning of the year a call for startups, okay? So now we're closely, seeking to close the loop with 3 startups. So, long way to go. Anyway, it's a very impressive. I've researched a lot. Like I said, for us, it's a benchmark that we're looking at. So if you could tell us more, about ArcView, the criteria, what kind of startups do you look for, in what sectors, and perhaps even if it's open for international business, as in, let's say there's a Brazilian startup seeking, because this is a global market, right? I mean, when we think about the cannabis business and we think about startups, we always tell the startups over here, I mean, you need to think global. I mean, you're not developing innovation for the Brazilian market. That's too small. I mean, you need to think about the big opportunity that is out there. So my question to you is like, what can we learn more about ArcView? And in the practical terms, I mean, what would be the pathway? Let's say a Brazilian company wants to apply for one of your acceleration programs.
So we are a unique organization in that we are a network of individual investors. And the role of ArcView is to create educational events and channels and platforms that bring investors who are interested in cannabis investments together with cannabis entrepreneurs who are seeking capital. Our selection process is driven by the investors. So we have a process where companies can send applications in Those applications are reviewed by our peer review committee. This is a committee of ArcView members who review each one of these proposals, and then they're selected for a weekly webinar. Then the winners of the weekly webinars, those who receive the most interest in the weekly webinars, can be invited to present on the ArcView stage at one of our conferences, or now, of course, we're doing more virtual events. It's also possible for a company to shortcut the peer review process by purchasing a sponsorship. And we have sponsorships at a variety of different levels that allow companies of various different sizes with different ambitions to be a part of the ecosystem. The really great thing about the ArcView group is it's a very collaborative environment. We have investors who have been there from the very beginning of cannabis investing. We were the very first cannabis investment organization in existence. And we have investors who are brand new and who are still coming in. And what we've done is really create a culture of collaboration that encourages these investors to pool their resources, to pool their knowledge, to collaborate with each other on due diligence, and to co-invest, and then to work on providing a supportive network for those companies to succeed. And some of the larger names that you've heard of in the industry, MJ Freeway, now Akerna, which is traded on the NASDAQ now, got their very first money. Ease, which is one of probably the largest cannabis delivery company in the state of California, got their first money at ArcView. MedMen, which has fallen upon some hard times, but has had a great run, got their first money at ArcView. So I absolutely encourage companies from all over the world to participate. Sometimes what we find is that there's a brilliant cannabis company that's located someplace where the market's just not ready for them. But there's other markets that are hungry for them and need just what they have. So please link up with us.
Oh, we will, for sure. Marcelo, please.
Yeah, is this the right time, this post-pandemic, is this the right time to invest in startups, Steve?
Well, I think it's always the right time to invest in the right startup. And in cannabis, I still think that we are, for some time forward, still in the golden age of cannabis investing. Meaning that because cannabis is still stigmatized, because cannabis still is not fully regulated, there's a great number of very powerful investors to whom the cannabis industry is still walled off. And that creates a unique opportunity for smaller entrepreneurs, for smaller ventures, for smaller investors to be able to get a foothold, to be able to get some of the kind of deals that normally are reserved only for the most powerful players in the market. I think that this is going to be true until you see legalization of cannabis at the federal level in the United States. That could come fairly soon if the Democrats win the next presidential election. There are some people who believe that President Biden could sign a bill to take dramatic federal action on cannabis in his first term. I think now is really the very best time for cannabis investing.
Thank you very much.
Steve, I mean, just the last comment from my side on this question is you mentioned quickly the word education. And there's lots in Brazil right now because of legislation that we cannot do. But there's lots that we can do. And the word education, I believe, is key. It's like a must do at this point. Educating doctors, educating, lawmakers, educating the general public. So it goes both ways, right? I mean, if there's a startup in your program that deals with education or digital for any kind, it's a bilateral thing. There's an opportunity in Brazil big time for these companies as well,
Well, there's certainly a few companies that I'll mention that too. Just to mention one, my very favorite cannabis educational company is greenfarmedia.com. They do an amazing job with cannabis training. But
is that the one you have the TV show?
I have a TV show on Greenflower Media. Yes, it's called Ask Steve. So it's shameless promotion. Yes, you can go there. But they are nonetheless the best training program out there. But look, the reason that education is important, it's critical, is because what we have found is that whenever we can engage in an evidence-based debate about cannabis, we win that debate. When we have an opportunity to teach people about the endocannabinoid system, when we have an opportunity to teach people about the homeostatic effect of cannabis in the human body, when we're able to educate people about the dramatic public safety and public health benefits that flow after legalization, the equally dramatic economic developments that happen after legalization. In the United States now, the cannabis industry employs more people than the coal industry does.
Than the what industry?
Than the coal industry. Coal. The black stuff you dig out of the ground to burn for electricity.
Oh, yes.
Carbon?
Okay. Yeah, carbon. Yeah.
Biochar.
Right. Yeah. So the educational piece is just critical. Once we have that evidence-based debate, then we start being able to move. The question is just being able to move beyond propaganda and move beyond stigma. This is why the parents of epileptic children have been so dramatically effective at beginning the process of an evidence-based debate on cannabis, because the emotional evidence, the emotional pull of a terribly ill child being healed by cannabis is such that it manages to cut through the stigma and cut through the propaganda, and it opens the doors to continuing that evidence-based discussion.
Evidence. Paula, please.
Humanitas 360 has Patricia Vilela, which is the owner. She has produced a documentary which made a really big change here in Brazil. It's called Illegal, and it showed this kind of process that you mentioned, where parents and the children, they lived with about hundreds of seizures a day, and they started to take the cannabis drugs, and they started to live better and improve drastically their quality of life. So this debate really changed the way Brazilian society saw cannabis at this time. And I wonder what else we can do so that in this process of education, what we can do more to try to break this prejudice.
So focus on sympathetic population groups. Another population group that can benefit tremendously from cannabis is seniors, senior citizens, elders, who in our country receive a huge amount of pharmaceutical drugs.
The baby boomers.
And those drugs, for the most part, are not very effective for them. And if you take a list of all of the things, all of the issues that seniors have, arthritis, insomnia, depression, lack of appetite, lack of libido, cannabis is very good for all of these things. So introducing cannabis to senior citizens, there's very good science showing that cannabis is tremendously effective at preventing and even treating Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And veterans, people who have suffered trauma. What we know about from our experience with combat veterans in the United States is that cannabis is one of the most effective ways to prevent suicide of people who are suffering from PTSD. So I imagine that there's police officers, soldiers, other people, not to mention, People have been in the favelas, people who have been in various different kinds of armed conflict and suffered trauma. Cannabis can be tremendously effective for people who have suffered trauma on all sides of conflict. You know, one of the projects that I love to talk about is a project that happened in Colombia. They're still trying to get it off the ground, but it's a project to build a village out of hemp. And the idea is to bring former combatants from both sides of the civil conflict together, 5,000 families from each side, to build a new village out of hemp that they grow together.
We are living a trauma nowadays of the pandemic, so it should be a really important and helpful tool to everybody.
Yeah.
One of the most exciting things we haven't talked about, but I will be talking about on my new podcast soon, is the potential of to prevent and treat COVID with cannabis. It turns out there's actually some very compelling science to explore there too.
Steve, just before I turn it back to Marcelo for his final question, I would like to point out the documentary that Paula mentioned. And this is an international broadcast. A lot of people from outside Brazil. This documentary called Illegal or Ilegal in Portuguese is available on, you know, YouTube, on Netflix. It's all over. It's just Google it up. And it just celebrated 5 years of the documentary now. And it's actually the story. It's about 40-minute documentary, I believe. And it's the story of how, you know, it all started in Brazil. So, you know, it's one of those documents that it's very important if you want to understand. Everybody that wants to understand about, you know, the history of cannabis in Brazil, it's a milestone. Let me put it that way in our history.
It was directed
Ilegal.
by Tasso Araújo and Rafael Erichsen.
Yes.
Just to credit the name.
And of course, Patricia, right? I mean, was one of the big, you know, supporters of the documentary. And 5 mothers, you know, and it's kind of like Charlotte, you know, that kind of like the same story, but what happened here in Brazil, and this was the very first push among everything that's happening right now. So, you know, it's very important for us. Documentary, important that people from outside Brazil have access to this film, which is beautiful.
It's such an important story, right? When this history is really fully known, and the heroes of this movement are honored, there will be statues built to those mothers, because they have really been the tip of the spear in cannabis reform in so many places. And you know, it really is just the tip of the spear. It's becoming clearer and clearer that cannabis is the most important medicine that we have on planet Earth. And it's those mothers and their courage that's really been so important in forcing the doors of debate open in many places: Brazil, Chile, the United States, all around the world.
Yeah, like my partner and friend, Dr. Preto says, mothers opens the door to the sky. So it's a really, yeah, this was what happened in Brazil. This is what pushes us to go forward.
Marcelo, since you're at it, please.
Great. So we see considerable hype around hemp. The cultivation of hemp can help to accelerate the exit of our country from the post-pandemic economic recession that may be to come. Generate jobs and tax collection to the country. Areas underutilized by agriculture may give space to new agribusiness production chain. We hear that in the United States, cannabis has a high value commodity and generated about almost $5 billion in 2019. So after struggling under decades of stigma, how should countries now explore hemp?
So when we talk about hemp, let's be clear what we're talking about. Right now, there is a boom going on I believe that boom is a bubble, which is being driven by the production of CBD, or is being driven by the cultivation of hemp, quote unquote hemp. But the purpose of that hemp is to be extracted for CBD. And the reason for that is that, like in Brazil and the United States, we have this designation that allows you to grow more easily as long as you're under the 0.3% in the United States. And so the most of the hemp that's being grown in the United States now is actually being grown for human consumption. That's one kind of hemp. I don't encourage anybody, particularly countries, to build a industry on that basis, because my belief is that as cannabis reform proceeds, and there are more markets that have access to the full range of cannabinoids, the demand for CBD and CBD alone is going to drop dramatically. Now, when I talk about hemp, I think about industrial hemp. I think about cannabis that is grown to make things out of rather than to consume. And I believe that by dollar value, this part of the cannabis economy is likely to be the most valuable part of the cannabis economy. I'll give you an example. There's a substance called hempcrete. Hempcrete is made very, very simply from the interior of the cannabis plant. It's very inexpensive material to make. It's as strong as regular concrete. It is more flame resistant than regular concrete. It has a neutral carbon footprint when it goes in, and it continues to sequester carbon over the course of years. So it is a tremendous building material. And just imagine the volume of concrete that is produced in Brazil right now, and say half of that or 3/4 of that becomes converted to cannabis. You're talking about something that's very robust, right? So I think hemp needs to be, I'm a big fan of industrial hemp. I think it needs to be approached at scale. You need to make sure that there's sufficient processing capacity to service the amount of acreage that's being planted. You need to make sure that there's enough demand for that processed raw material to turn into consumer ready or industry ready goods. So it has to be planned carefully, and it has to be done at scale. I'll give you an example of what can happen if you don't do that. In the United States, because cotton became such a popular fiber, all of the spinneries that make yarn that worked with long fibers, hemp is a long fiber, have been closed. So recently, Levi's decided that they wanted to make a hemp jean, because the hemp jean uses 1/3 the amount of water that their regular jean uses. But the only way that they were able to do that, because there's a shortage of long fiber spinneries in North America, was to do what they called cottonizing the hemp fiber. They basically blew it up into tiny little pieces so that it's very similar to cotton, which is a terrible thing to do to hemp.
Yeah, people have to learn. They need to learn how to use hemp. On that line, I have another question. I know that we have over 25,000 products that we can manufacture. We can substitute plastic and utilize the fibers and do biochar, and it's a wonderful plant from top to bottom. You can use the whole plant. But you were saying about the bad quality products that are coming out of hemp for consumable goods. Even if we approach hemp more scientifically and medically, do you think we can make better infused products or not?
Oh, I think it's very easy to make a super high quality infused cannabis product, whether that's any type of cannabis. I mean, cannabis in the right kind of substance infuses very, very easily. I don't think that's really the issue. I think that what we're seeing with CBD is that there's a huge amount of overproduction in the United States right now. relative to the demand. And so the price of that raw material has dropped very, very significantly, and some farmers aren't even able to recover their costs. So I think that the CBD, the consumable part of the hemp industry, is not reliable. And so if you're going to build a hemp industry, you build a hemp industry for textiles, you build a hemp industry for construction materials, you build a hemp industry so that you can grow on marginal land or land that has been contaminated that needs phytoremediation. You grow cannabis so that you can extract it for biofuels. And there you have something that it can work in the internal economy. Brazil, I imagine, imports a great deal of petroleum. Well, you can take seeds from a cannabis plant, you can press those seeds, they make a beautiful emerald green oil that can be used as is with doing nothing else in most diesel engines. And with the addition of about 10% ethanol, can be used in almost any diesel engine. So when grown at scale and properly and extracted properly, cannabis can be a viable alternative to imported petroleum.
Well, Steve, that was a really, really nice sense. That cleared a lot of things in my head. And thank you very much for that wonderful answer.
My pleasure.
He's a researcher on this theme. You just made him very happy there. Look, we're just about to wrap up. I don't want to go over time. Respect Steve's time, which is very precious. So, turn it to Daniel for his last question. I don't really have a question. It's more like a remark, and we can go for a round of. Before we go for the round of applauses, I mean, for a round of final considerations, let's put it that way. So, Daniel, please go ahead.
Hey, Steve. So we know that in the United States, each state has its own cannabis regulation. Could you give us an overview of the maturity of the medical cannabis in the United States, and those states that had approved the adult use? Could you how has been this transition for adult use, and how is the market, and how is it going today?
So today, when I opened Harborside in 2006, California was the only medical cannabis state in the United States. Today, there are, I believe, 34 or 35 medical cannabis states. The laws vary from place to place in those states. There's another 11 states that have complete adult use laws, and there are only 4 states in the United States that have failed to reform their cannabis laws in some way.
Only
what
4?
We've seen, only 4,
okay.
The very most conservative states in the country. What we've seen is that as medical cannabis states transition to adult use, the medical sector of the market usually shrinks quite dramatically. There's a number of reasons for that, but most often it's a regulatory reason. What we find is that for political reasons, it's very difficult for states to impose taxes, or at least to impose high taxes on medical cannabis. But it's quite easy for them to impose very high taxes on adult use, or quote unquote recreational cannabis. And so it is in the interest of the regulating authorities to collect as much tax revenue as possible. And so they tend to incentivize participation in the adult use part of the market, or the taxed part of the market, and disincentivize participation in the medical part of the market. This is really a tragedy for medical cannabis patients. In California, I think 50% or more medical cannabis patients statewide have returned back to the underground market because they can't afford the high prices in the regulated adult use market. So it is something to be looked at very, very carefully. To be honest with you, it has been problematic in most places where where we've had that transition. And other places, as reform progresses, hopefully, rather than what I consider to be these artificial distinctions into medical or recreational cannabis, we can really understand cannabis for what I believe it is, which is a wellness product that operates across a spectrum of wellness.
Good, thank you.
Well, the word wellness has to do with my, you're a writer. I mean, you write books, and one that was a very popular one, of course, was the Manifesto, right? Cannabis, which was written, I believe, in 2015. Is that correct, or ish?
Published in 2015, written in 2014.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, about 5 years now, and it already had the word, the paradigm of wellness, and wellness is all we talk about. It's all that really matters is health, wellness. Making us live longer with a better quality of life. The way this world is kind of crazy nowadays. We need wellness. We need cannabis more than ever. I mean, this is, I believe, the opinion here, 100% of the group that's in talking here. And what I wanted you to say is, I mean, what can you tell us about your new book that you mentioned to me when we first spoke? That what's the main message? I mean, that's coming up. I mean, just I don't give it a spoiler, but what can you say about your upcoming book? Let's hope we have it in Brazil shortly.
So what I'm working on now is a book-length version of my presentation that I did at South by Southwest last year, entitled The Cannabis Renaissance. And the Cannabis Renaissance sort of starts where the Cannabis Manifesto left off. In the Cannabis Manifesto, I was really talking about the harms that prohibition had created, and some of the new science on cannabis, and the way forward in terms of how we should think about cannabis to get legalization in place. With the Cannabis Renaissance, I asked the question, okay, now that we've been able to make some reforms, what have we learned and where are we headed? And one of the points that I make is that today, unlike 10 years ago, we now have a track record. We don't have to worry to speculate about what happens when cannabis is legalized. We can just look at the publicly available statistics and records of several American states that have gone through the experience. And when we do that, what do we find? We find that there's this very wide range of benefits, that pharmaceutical consumption goes down, alcohol consumption gomes down, violent crime goes down, domestic abuse goes down, taxation goes up, employment goes up, and it's very consistent. You can see it time after time. So that's part of the point that I'm making. And then I'm also pointing towards the future. And I'm thinking about a time when we really fully develop the potential of hemp. And just imagine, if you would, a truck like the Amazon trucks that are delivering packages all the time. But this truck, the body of the truck is made out of hemp plastic. And all of the boxes in that truck and all of the plastic that's wrapping those boxes are made out of sustainable, ecologically grown hemp. Right? And half of the products in those boxes are made out of hemp. And the fuel that the truck runs on is a hemp biofuel, or maybe it's electricity from a hemp-powered electrical plant. And when the driver puts on her shoes or her uniform, that's made out of hemp. When she stops at the cafe to have lunch, her salad dressing is made out of hemp. The bread that she eats is made out of hemp powder, and the waiter's uniform is made out of a hemp textile. This is the world that we're heading to, and it will be a much, much healthier world because we will be able to provide for all of our needs without cutting down the last tree on the planet, without turning Earth into a cinder.
Perfect. Yep. Same page. Totally, totally agree. Laughing out loud here. Let's circle around. Ladies first. Paula, if you could start, your final remarks so that we can thank Steve and wrap it up. Please go ahead.
Well, it was so great to hear you and hear about your experience. I think we have a lot to learn from your experience, to not repeat the same mistakes, make some other mistakes. And in Humanitas, we are, as I said, we are working with women in prison, and we are now starting to, with this pandemics, we started to a program to make virtual visits in the prison units, and we work mainly with women from the Northeast Brazil, and they are very poorly educated. They are raised in a process of violence and prejudice and structural racism. And I really hope that this change in drug reform and drug law could also benefit those people in jail. And I think this is what Humanitas 360 works to do. And so it was very nice to hear your experience, and we hope we can do some more things together.
Okay. Daniel, would you like to go?
Yeah.
Give it a shot, please.
Thank you very much for your time, for being here with us. And was, as we mentioned here, it's really important to bring knowledge, education, information, and you have a vast experience that you can bring to Brazil. You can help us to open this path in order to regulate cannabis here. And I hope it was the first thing that we can make together. And maybe next time you could be here in Brazil personally and to learn more about our country, our situation, the cannabis industry here, and be part of our history too.
Thanks, Daniel. Marcelo, this is
Steve.
Italian. These guys are Italian, by the way, Steve.
Marcelo Grecco.
Famiglia italiana.
Tutti buona gente. Steve, all I have to say is that I'm really, really, really grateful for this opportunity to have had this talk with you. And again, like everybody else, I wish we can have other opportunities to share information and bring all that knowledge here to our country. Thank you very much again.
It's your statement, my friend. For my side, all I can say is all of the above. Plus, I truly hope this is just our first step. The doors in Brazil, I mean, people are friendly. People like you. People like what you say. And let's create the situations, with projects like Paula said, with events, business on the social side, what have you. Okay, so we'll keep in touch for sure, and it's up to you, to wrap it up. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Alec, and Marcelo. Thank you, Danielle, Paula. It's just been a pleasure speaking with all of you. I love being involved at this time. For me, the very, very beginning of cannabis reform is the most exciting time. And the reason for that has to do with the way that I think about opportunity in the cannabis industry. This is going to be a huge industry. I'm convinced it will be the largest industry globally. People who are involved in it early, who work hard, who are diligent, who are persistent, even if the first ventures that they get involved with fail, ultimately are going to do well. So the idea, the likelihood that 20 years from now, as we look over our shoulders, most of us will have been able to build a little bit of wealth, or at least build some very good careers. And that's opportunity. It's one way to think about opportunity. But we have this other opportunity with the cannabis industry because it is brand new. You know, most industries, they don't start the way our industry starts. Most industries develop organically over time, and they emerge out of a set of practices and mores and standards that have been there for a long while. Not true with legal cannabis. This industry is a blank slate. This industry will become whatever we make it into. And so we have this opportunity to create not just a new industry, but a new kind of industry, to take a look at the kind of business structures that we have in the world today and find ways that we can make improvements. And what does that mean, right? Well, it means diversity. It means making sure that we incorporate that this lesson that cannabis teaches us about including everybody into our business structures, and that we have a truly diverse industry where women, where people of color, where people with different orientations have an opportunity to come into the industry and to thrive. And you know, that includes all of the traditional producers of cannabis. It means creating an industry where sustainability it's a basic threshold. You know, we should not think about doing anything in the cannabis industry unless we do it sustainably. We should be thinking about building in more economic justice. You know, in the United States right now, our streets are exploding. And one of the reasons that they're exploding is because of institutional racism and inequality of wealth. And so as we address diversity in the industry, we also have to make sure that there's plenty of opportunity for everybody who participates in this industry to be well rewarded in it and share in the prosperity. So we have a lot of opportunities. All we need to do is look around at the things that we don't like and figure out new ways to do them better. And cannabis offers us that really amazing opportunity. And I believe that that when we do take a rest, when we look over our work some decades from now, that the part that we'll take the greatest pride in is the part of building that new kind of industry.
So please, a round of applause here for our special guest.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. And like I said, we'll make it happen. We'll see you around in Brazil soon, hopefully, okay? Take care.
All right,
Be
next
safe.
year in Rio.
Okay.
Let's wrap
All right,
up
be
this
well,
session.
be free, everybody. Until next time.
Bye-bye, Steve. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.